As Dante and Virgil descend to increasingly lower levels of hell, we feel the thermometer dropping, both in terms of the ice which holds the souls imprisoned, but also in terms of the spiritual coldness of the individual souls. The remaining canti of Inferno, canti 27 to 34, which we'll discuss today, are occupied, broadly speaking, by two groups of sinners. The last of the fraudulent souls, stuffed into the lowest ditches of the Malebolge, and the traitorous souls, who are frozen and locked into the circular base of hell, the frozen river of Cocytus. As the two travelers move through these ditches, we notice a number of overarching themes. First of all, with increasing frequency, we hear of souls who refuse to reveal their names. In earlier canti, we have sinners such as Vanni Fucci, or Farinata, or Francesca, who are all too happy to share their names, stories, and personal details. But here in Deep Hell, the pilgrim begins to encounter a number of souls who have so willingly broken themselves off from the human community that they don't wish to play any part in human society again, either directly or even through being remembered. Secondly, the final canti are extraordinarily violent. At the beginning of Canto 28, for example, the canto of the schismatics, Dante racks his brain to recall all the stories of wounds and cadavers from wars old and new, and says that if you heaped up all these wounded bodies, you would not be so horrified as he was in this ditch. He will then encounter souls whose bodies are sliced and dismembered like pieces of meat in a butcher's shop. He will encounter souls itching so much from skin diseases that they're scratching their skin right off. He'll encounter the soul of Ugolino, who is forever biting into the head of his hated enemy, Ruggeri. Indeed, it seems as Dante nears the bottom of hell, he pulls out all the stops in his quest to create the language of breaking glass and fingernails on the chalkboard, in an attempt to summon and harness the full power to convey the devastating sense of the brokenness of humanity. And thirdly, in addition to the violence, the wounds, the disease, the hatred, and the intense spiritual frigidity of isolation, we have one more motif throughout lower hell, the theme of tears. It's interesting to note that although the words of lagrime or lagrimare, the words for tears and crying, appear over 30 times in the comedy, all of those instances occur in the Inferno and Purgatorio. And yet, although we hear of tears and laments throughout the first two canticles, tears seem to come more often and more copiously as we get closer to the base of hell. In Canto 32, for example, we hear of two sinners who are glued to one another by their tears. In Inferno 33, we hear that sinners are actually unable to cry because their tears freeze and form visors on their eyes. As much as they would like to give relief to the pent-up pain within, they're unable to because their eyes are frozen. Their souls are almost overwhelmed with the grief they cannot release. And of course, in the final canto of the Inferno, we meet a Satan who sheds copious tears as he remembers how beautiful he once was. But as he sheds those tears, he also creates a bath which he freezes by the furious beating of his wings. He struggles and fights and desires to lift himself out of his own misery. But every stubborn action exerted in hope of liberation only makes him more bound, which results in more tears. And these tears bind him ever more fixedly in his own eternal misery. But let's turn now to looking at some of the individual scenes. In Canto 27, Virgil and the pilgrim are still in that ditch of the Malebolge, where the false counselors are punished. They are now, you will remember, embodied within flames. After speaking to Ulysses, the pilgrim is approached by a second soul, who says he spends his eternity in tearful lamentation. His name is Guido da Montefeltro. He lived from 1220 to 1298. Thus we have a medieval Italian soldier whose placement here in Canto 27 complements the ancient Greek Ulysses encountered in the previous canto. Guido, like Farinata, fought at first for the Ghibelline cause. When Guido's soul steps forward, his first attempt to speak is a mere bellowing, a terrible groaning, which takes a while to finally find itself expressed in articulate language. The pilgrim and Virgil both notice that from the tip of the flickering flame a gibberish emerges. As the Sicilian bull that bellowed first with the cries of him whose instrument had fashioned it, used to bellow with the victim's voice, so that although the bull was made of brass, it seemed transfixed by pain. Thus, having first no course or outlet, through the flame the mournful words were changed into a language of their own. But once the words had made their way up to the tip, making it flicker, as the voice had done when it had formed them, we heard it say. The simile is rather ominous, referring to an ancient myth about a giant bronze bull which was constructed for the torture of the tyrant's enemies. We have then already a kind of parallel with the life and exploits of Ulysses, another man who constructed an engine of deception. The Trojan horse, a false sign to deceive which ultimately led to his own undoing in hell. We also have in the example of Guido a powerful contrapasso, in which the slick salesman of words and purveyor of selfish advice is here punished by his inability even to get those words out. Guido abused language and life, and so his facility and glibness are now badly hampered in death. But on another level, we recognize that being trapped in your own language is an important theme of the lowest section of hell. In Canto 31, on the very verge of the deep pit of hell, Dante and Virgil have to be lifted down by a very unusual elevator. One of the many giants from ancient mythology who spent their lives in rebellion against heaven. But just before this, they meet the legendary king who is responsible for organizing the building project of the Tower of Babel, whom medieval scholars called Nimrod. When he sees the pilgrim, he shouts, "Rafael maya meke zabealmi," which is not Italian. In fact, it's a made-up nonsense language. Virgil then explains, he is his own accuser. This is Nimrod, because of whose vile plan the world no longer speaks a single tongue. Let us leave him and not waste our speech. For every language is to him as his to others, and his is understood by none. Nimrod, the ambitious and proud king, who had designs to forge his own path to God, is here reduced to an ultimate isolation. It's a powerful psychological portrait. You can imagine the completely self-absorbed individual constantly meditating on his own private and secretive plans. He slowly loses touch with reality, like Dostoevsky's Raskolnikov. Because he's driven by an obsessive, egoistic mania, he loses touch with others and effectively reduces himself to speaking a language understood by none but himself. But to return to Guido da Montefeltro, we note that after the pilgrim relates to him a sad report of the incessant wars of northeastern Italy, verses 25 to 54, which had not quieted down after Guido's death, and then asks the shade who he was in life, the soul famously responds, "If I but thought that my response were made to one perhaps returning to the world, this tongue of flame would cease to flicker. But since up from these depths no one has yet returned alive, if what I hear is true, I answer without fear of being shamed." Guido does not want to be recalled. He does not want to be remembered. In earlier circles, even if souls pursued one good with immoderation or were snared by an excessive love of some good in earthly life, they still could boast at least of having done other good things, and thus had a right to be recalled among the living. But as we descend deeper and deeper, we meet souls who spent their whole lives in self-centered calculation, manipulating the world around them, setting souls at odds against one another in a radically self-centered existence. And thus in hell, they are embarrassed even to have their names repeated. This is what I mean by spiritual coldness of hell. It's a touchiness and a sad, morose desire to be left alone. As the pilgrim gets lower and lower toward the center of the earth, he gets farther and farther away from the stars. That is, away from beauty, away from harmony, away from order, away from love. The landscape gets colder and colder, as a kind of perfect symbol for how the heart freezes the more it chooses its own good and leaves behind participation in loving human communion. Guido then tells his story. He was a soldier and a famous strategist. We know from other sources that he fought for the Ghibellines against the papal party, the Guelphs. He was then accomplished at using stratagem and craft to effect whatever end was desirable. But he repented and became a Franciscan in 1296. All would have been well for him if he had not failed his final trial. The Pope whom Dante hated the most, Boniface VIII, was faced with a rebellion led this time by a Ghibelline faction, and he called upon the old soldier for help to suppress the faction he had once fought for. Guido obliged and died 2 years later in Assisi. But in Dante's story, it was Boniface VIII who promised the reformed soldier that if he did this one last act for him, his sin would be pardoned. In Guido's words, "Cunning stratagems and covert schemes, I knew them all and was so skilled in them. My fame rang out to the far confines of the earth. When I saw I had reached that stage of life when all men ought to think of lowering sail and coiling up the ropes, I grew displeased with what had pleased me once. Repentant and shriven, I became a friar. And woe is me. It would have served, but he, prince of the latter-day Pharisees, engaged in battle near the Lateran, and not with either Saracen or Jew, for all his enemies were Christian, paid no heed to the highest office or his holy orders, nor to the cord that used to keep its wearers lean. He asked me for advice, but I kept silent, and then he spoke again. Let not your heart mistrust. I absolve you here and now if you will teach me how I can bring Praenesti to the ground. I have the power as well, you know, to lock. His threatening tactics brought me to the point at which the worst course seemed the one of silence. Thus the man who spent his life practicing and outwitting others allowed himself to be fooled by Pope Boniface. But in death he could not use his clever tricks to work his way out of his eternal damnation. Guido, like so many other souls in hell, blames another. And he, of course, is partly correct. Boniface, as Dante tells the story at least, certainly collaborated in his damnation. But what Guido fails to mention, and this is the theme which will be one of the most prominent in purgatory, is that he still had his own freedom. Guido says that the Pope's threatening tactics brought me to the point at which the worst course seemed the one of silence. Pause to consider this a moment. Is this true? Would it have been worse for Guido to refuse to aid the Pope? Guido probably rightly realized that if he did refuse to give his crooked advice, he would be punished. But we can only truly say this was the worst course within a very limited scope of observation. It might have been worse at that moment, but Guido failed to consider his actions within a larger context, within the context of eternity. He failed to view this choice, as the medievals like to say, sub specie aeternitatis, in light of eternity. Thus we have another personal tragedy. Not unlike the suicide we met in the wood, Pierre delle Vigne in Inferno 13. With an opportunity to become a hero, he balked and chose a momentary good. It's also interesting to note that T.S. Eliot intentionally recalled Guido in the epigraph to his 1917 poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. In that poem, Eliot writes out the sad, lonely interior monologue of a modern man living in London who lacks the boldness necessary to propose to his beloved, and thus ends his life, sadly, alone, walking on the beach and hearing the empty roaring of the waves. The epigraph to the poem is formed of those very words I quoted earlier. If I thought my response were made to one perhaps returning to the world. In other words, Eliot found in Guido's damned soul a tendency to isolated loneliness, an inability to delight in the company of other human beings, which Eliot found a powerful image to capture the quality of modern life. After Dante and Virgil leave Guido behind, they visit the last two ditches of the Malebolge, where the schismatics have their bodies sliced and divided with sharp swords, and then the final ditch, where the counterfeiters are punished. Those who practiced alchemy, those who impersonated other people while living, and those who created false coinage. In other words, those who created worthless false images and then passed them off as true. Again, it's striking for the modern reader as I like to say, that for Dante, he thinks photocopying a $20 bill and spending it is more evil than getting into a drunken fight in a bar. Or perhaps we could put it this way, that a bad and ideologically committed college professor is more evil than a murderer, because he distorts his students' vision of reality. Such is Dante's commitment to the word and the image. For Dante, falsifying the image of nature, obscuring reality through a false reproduction, producing images which mislead, is more destructive than harming bodies. Dante, the poet, the great craftsman of language and words, feels in his guts the sacred responsibility to use language with exactitude and precision, and to create images which show forth the actual nature of reality. And vice versa, he's horrified at language which obfuscates our view of what is. In Canto 28, though, this is where Dante meets the schismatics, by which he meant men and women who were not just heretics, but who were leaders of divisive sectarian groups. For Dante, Muhammad was the chief example, because Dante thought Muhammad was a Christian who founded his own religion in pursuit of power. His description of Muhammad is one of the most graphically violent and crude of the whole comedy. He begins with an elaborate comparison. Could all the wounded troops again assemble, first from Apulia, land laid low by war, and those whose bones still lie in heaps at Ceperano, where each Apulian played it false, and those near Tagliacozzo, where old Alardo conquered without force of arms, and should one show his limb pierced through, another his where it has been cut off, it would be nothing to the ninth pit's filth. Add up all the wars and wounded, heap up their corpses and lacerated flesh, and you could hardly equal the horror of this pit of hell. And then he sees Muhammad, and compares him to a hacked-up barrel, badly split by a crude instrument. No cask ever gapes so wide for loss, or mid or side stave as the soul I saw, cleft from the chin right down to where men fart. Between the legs the entrails dangled. I saw the innards and the loathsome sack that turns what one has swallowed into shit. While I was caught up in the sight of him, he looked at me and with his hands ripped apart his chest, saying, "See how I rend myself." This is shocking, even for us. What happened to the love poet of delicate language and refined sentiment? Here we have tough, rough, and crude words as if the poet is belching or vomiting forth a violent description. Why so much linguistic violence? Why such crudity and obscenity? As we've said, Dante's the poet of X-ray vision, who longs to turn inside out that which he thinks we hide within. For Dante, Muhammad, as well as the many other sectarian leaders he quickly packs into this canto, were responsible for wounding and dismembering sacred bodies, that is, the body of Christ or the body politic. Because they themselves did not treat those assemblies of people as bound by a mystical love or a heavenly mission, as a group unified by more than their physical bodies, Dante here allows their own human bodies to be similarly reduced to the crude and broken machinery of bodily functions. The digestive system in poor Muhammad hangs out. Others have their tongues sliced, and Bertram de Born, who divided royal son against royal father, carries his head in his hands. The schismatics failed on earth to pay respect to those sacred bodies of humans gathered into communion, and so they have their own precious bodies vulgarly demystified here in hell below. They walk around the circle slowly, one which is 22 miles around, Virgil tells us in the next canto. And as they go round, their bodies seem to begin to heal, only to be reopened and rewounded as soon as they have come back to the starting point of the circle. It's a powerful image of the schismatic, those who don't just disagree on principle, but almost take delight that they are right and others are wrong. In their heart of hearts, Dante seems to suggest, they don't wish for true healing. Before we move on to the bowels of hell, we have to point out two interesting moments in the next canti, 29 and 30, which treat the counterfeiters. The first takes place at the beginning of Canto 29. The second one is found at the end of Canto 30. This second rebuke by Virgil, following in quick succession after the first, is issued just after Dante has seemingly with great enjoyment listened to the quarrelsome dispute between the two counterfeiters, Sinon, who is the Greek, as described in Virgil's Aeneid, who convinces the Trojans to take the Trojan horse into their city, and then an obscure medieval figure, Master Adam, who evidently was a counterfeiter of coins. And one of them who took offense, perhaps, at being named so vilely, hit him with a fist right on his rigid paunch. It boomed out like a drum. Then Master Adam, whose arm seemed just as sturdy, used it, striking Sinon in the face, saying, "Although I cannot move about because my legs are heavy, my arm is loose enough for such a task." To which the other answered, "When they put you to the fire, your arm was not so nimble, though it was quick enough when you were coining." And the dropsied one, "Well, that is true, but you were hardly such a truthful witness when you were asked to tell the truth at Troy." "If I spoke falsely, you falsified the coin," said Sinon, "and I am here for one offense alone, but you for more than any other devil." We soon see that Dante rather enjoyed this slapstick comic wrangling of Master Adam and Sinon, and it is a bit clever. But the pilgrim is bitterly rebuked by Virgil for taking too much delight from this scene. Thus it seems that the pilgrim fails in his inability to view these incidents, as we've said, sub specie aeternitatis, in light of eternity. The comic wrangling might be funny, but imagine it playing on in this mode for eternity. Sinon, offended and embarrassed and full of wrath, tries to outdo Master Adam, and now wound him with his words, to which Master Adam bends all of his clever intellect to hurt his neighbor in return. It's a parody of human community. These two must dwell with one another forever in discord, full of feverish desire to belittle and debase their fellow. Thus on the surface we have a bit of comedy, but viewed deeper, we have an eternal tragic affair, a parodic twisting of the human communion these two were meant for. The scene of the quarreling counterfeiters prepares us perfectly for the final Canti of hell, where we now meet the traitorous. Each one of these traitorous broke the trust of those who placed their faith in them, but in different ways. Some violated the trust of family members, some broke the trust of fellow citizens, and some betrayed their lords, such as the assassins of Caesar, Brutus and Cassius, and Judas Iscariot. These, of course, are munched on in the mouths of Satan. These are extraordinarily fast-moving canti, in which Dante packs in a dizzying amount of traitors into just two canti, 32 and 33, reserving the final canto for a description of Satan. We have not only biblical and classical traitors, but also traitors from medieval history, who, apart from Dante, would have been mostly forgotten. There are those who murdered relations, the pair of brothers Alessandro Napoleone degli Alberti, Mordred, who killed Arthur, as well as other murderers of relatives, Focaccia and Salso Mascheroni. All of these sinners unwillingly have their identities betrayed, as it were, by the only speaker in Canto 32, Camicioni de Pazzi, and in quick succession. And this is also where, in particular, the poet expresses his longing for verses harsh enough and rasping, what comes through in the Italian as le rime aspre e chiocce. The opening verses of Canto 32 are quite extraordinary. If I had verses enough and rasping, as would befit this dismal hole, upon which all the other rocks weigh down, more fully would I press out the juice of my conception. But since I lack them, with misgiving do I bring myself to speak. It is no enterprise undertaken lightly to describe the very bottom of the universe, nor for a tongue that still cries mommy and daddy. In other words, we have it from Dante that he's trying to create a poetry which by the end of these canti will leave you dizzy, almost nauseated upon encountering the human heart in the worst state of its possible existence. This is a task so far beyond just stating commonplaces or Sunday school lessons about what actions you should avoid. Rather, if Dante is successful, he wants you to have a deep and abiding repulsion for those actions which often, even if we know they're harmful, we don't get all that vexed about them. Dante was very much aware of how difficult this would be for the ordinary language of Italian. He had to get all the power of the old epics into that language, which, as he said, cries mama and babbo. And here the poet, much like the pilgrim, lets all compassion die. The poet cries out in 32:13-15, "Oh, you misbegotten rabble, worse than all the rest, who fill that place so hard to speak of. Better had you here been sheep or goats." Later on, Dante tells the Pisans that he hopes they will all drown. You can feel the poet letting go. At the same time, the pilgrim kicks the sinner Bocca degli Aberti in the face with hardly an apology, and then kneels down to start tearing clumps out of his frozen hair in order to force the stubborn soul to reveal his name. In Canto 33, the pilgrim deceives a soul, fooling him into thinking he will help him by removing the ice from his eyes. He betrays the traitor, as it were. The pitiful sinner says, "But now extend your hand and open my eyes for me." And the poet continues, "I did not open them, and to be rude to him was courtesy." What on earth is going on? Moments like these have led eminent scholars to call Dante hateful and vengeful. Is the poet of love slipping? Is he becoming the poet of hate? Is this his chance to lash out at the world which had betrayed him? Before trying to answer this question, let me tell briefly a couple of their stories and then describe the final image of Satan. With these details in mind, we'll be able to address these questions. The sinner whose hair is pulled out in clumps is Bocca degli Abbati. Bocca was one of the few Ghibellines who was not exiled from Florence in 1258. Although he claimed to be now a supporter of the Guelph faction, at the Battle of Montefeltro, he cut off the hand of the Florentine standard-bearer, which created panic in the Guelph lines and led to the disastrous defeat of the Guelphs at that battle. Ugolino, in Canto 33, who was fiercely biting and gnawing the head of Ruggieri, the Archbishop of Pisa. Ugolino was the leader of the Guelphs in Pisa, and he entered into traitorous negotiations with the Ghibelline party, but he was betrayed by the Archbishop of Pisa, Ruggieri. He, along with his children, was imprisoned within a tower and allowed to starve to death. Fra Alberigo is the sinner who asked Dante to remove the ice from his eyes. He was from a small Italian town, and in 1284 he discovered that a close relative, Manfred, had been plotting against him. Alberigo, having discovered the plot, publicly said he forgave Manfred and chalked it up to the impetuousness of youth. Years later, Alberigo invited Manfred and his son to dinner, and after having eaten the main course, Alberigo called out to the servants, "Bring out the fruit!" At which point assassins, hidden behind tapestries, rushed forward and killed Manfred and his son. With these sinners fresh in mind, we come to Canto 34, and at last meet Satan. As Dante points out, once the most fair of all creatures is now reduced to this: the wings of a bat, bloody saliva drooling from the mouths of his three monstrous heads, engaged in absolutely futile attempt to escape, which ironically, the more intense it is, the more a prisoner he makes himself. Scholars have pointed out that the three heads of different colors help us see in this image of Satan a parody of the Trinity. Even here, in the heart of hell, the image of God or his presence in memory cannot be erased. The arch-traitor, he who betrayed God, here chomps on three sinners who conformed themselves to his image through treachery. One rejected the God-man, and two who slew Providence's attempt to rule human affairs. But what has always interested me the most is the fascinating observation if somehow Satan could but momentarily stop the beating of his wings, then perhaps the ice which imprisons him would melt, and he could go free. But here he is, left entirely to his own choosing. He's left free to seek what his heart desires, and thus his furious rebellion ensures he will forever remain in captivity. Satan is the slave of his own freedom. In a similar way, to return to our question stated above, The traitorous souls, I think, reveal that they continue to choose what their hearts long for, a crooked and traitorous love of self at the expense of all other members of the human community. When harmed by the pilgrim, they cry out, outraged and offended by the pilgrim's seeming lack of justice. But precisely in doing so and crying out for justice, they demonstrate a striking ignorance that they themselves had committed the same injustice in life. They still have not learned their lesson. And at the same time, the only way the pilgrim can come to know their names is through the betrayal by other traitors. None of the souls seem to note the just irony that to be betrayed is the due reward for those who spent their lives traitorously. But even here, even now, they are allowed their freedom, with which they choose to remain in isolation from the human community, unconcerned with their actions on others. They are, as I have said, left with the desire of their hearts. I think that for Dante, this ongoing and eternal decision to be at odds with the human community, to betray, means that they cancel out the justice they are owed on account of their humanity. But having come to the end of the Inferno, we're in a position to look back and sum up some of the broad observations we've made throughout on Dante, his poetry, and the Inferno in particular. And I want to address three things: Dante's incarnational poetry, his use of moral X-ray vision, and finally, the role of history in the comedy. Recall the hundreds of characters we've met, the dozens of literary allusions, the great variety of landscapes, deserts, forests, mountains, castles, and ice, as well as networks of rivers and streams, marshes and swamps. Dante has drawn characters from the shadowy past of ancient mythology, heroes and villains and philosophers from classical history, saints from the early church, and politicians and crooks taken from his own contemporary European world. And he takes all these diverse historical ages and figures and then places them in precise locations in an imaginary landscape which his pilgrim slowly walks through. To be sure, Dante, to construct the geography of his own hell's landscape, borrowed from previous writings, especially from Virgil's Book 6 from the Aeneid, as well as other late antique Christian visions of the afterlife. But Dante's genius is that he follows no one author exclusively, but takes all of his readings, melts them down into a new vision. He creates then a palpable, concrete imaginary landscape which is meant to embody and represent those abstract principles of ancient moral philosophy and medieval theology which we encounter in the sinners. Dante takes the invisible world, that is the world of the heart, of the reality of love, of moral character, of the intellect, of the virtues, as well as the world of the vices and evil. All those things which at one level or another we sense to exist, but which we cannot see or hear with the bodily senses. And then he renders them palpable and tangible. Dante clothes the invisible world in an incarnate form. And in this way, the poet constructing a literary world imitates God, who also gave bodily existence to the plans of his mind, but who also took on flesh and became visible. Thus, for Dante, his poetic exercise is deeply theological. At the same time, Dante's poetry is meant to do something, we could say, deeply ethical. You remember the line from the Psalms, "Taste and see that the Lord is good." That is, the Psalms bid us not just to know the Lord is good, to reason about his goodness, but to taste him, to behold him, to look upon him, to experience him with the full range of human powers. Indeed, Dante was the heir to 2 centuries immediately prior to him, in which there was a great flowering, not only of precise theological treatises, most famously that of Thomas Aquinas, but also of devotional manuals, that is, books written to facilitate an effective encounter with God. Of course, what we think can move us. But what stands before us and is made visible can command our attention because it speaks to us through the ears, as well as through the eyes, through the sense of touch, and for medieval Christians, through the sense of taste. Thus, for Dante, this attempt to render visible the spiritual realities, those invisible realities of the mind and heart, is in part an effort to get his readers to respond to those truths with the full range of the affectus, that is, from the depths of the heart, the will, and the mind. This is one reason, I think, why Dante wrote a vision, that is, why he rendered bodily and visible the spiritual realities he believed in. But at the same time, he also realized that he wanted to employ what I have frequently called the moral X-ray vision. What do I mean by this? I mean that Dante knows that we often know in our brains that a certain action or thought is vicious, harmful, and so forth, and does not lead to our happiness or that of our brothers. And yet we still in our heart of hearts, desire it. Take the example of having a prestigious job. Many of you will probably understand the desire to work at a major law firm in a big city, to be a famous surgeon at a leading hospital, or to be a professor at a Stanford or a Harvard. In your heart of hearts, though, you might also recognize that such a prestigious position, though not bad in itself, might not be everything you imagine it to be. Working on Wall Street, for example, might bring huge amounts of money, but you sacrifice your time with your family, a sense of quiet, and perhaps deeper, more meaningful work. And yet, despite your head knowledge, you go on longing for the thing you know might not bring you any more good. Similar things could be said for so many other aspects of life. Perhaps you desire to appear attractive in a younger man or woman's eyes, even though you're already married. Perhaps you desire an expensive and lavish house beyond your income, even though you already know that you have what suits you perfectly well. The problem is, we humans, though we sometimes know definitively that some of our desires are not conducive to our own happiness, yet we find ourselves unable to shake them off. At the same time, we sometimes are afraid of the hard work necessary to achieve truly good things. We might want a good relationship with our children, but after a day of taking care of them, we're too tired to exert that extra effort to play with them or read to them. We might love the idea of being close to God in prayer, but we're undisciplined in our daily spiritual exercises. We might long for wisdom, but we never get on a proper program of study which will yield those results in the future. Dante's poetry, then, provides a kind of X-ray vision. He turns things inside out so that we see down to the rotten core, or discover the beauteous pearl hidden inside the slimy oyster. In hell, Dante dredges the soul and makes manifest those parts of the heart which human beings want to hide. He tries to disenchant us with those objects we already know won't help us by turning them inside out and revealing their inner uncleanness. In this way, Dante's Inferno has a kind of prophetic voice, not in the sense that he had access to some special revelation, but rather that his voice cries out and reveals the heart of the matter to us. It renders the sinfully attractive repulsive and cold, and it transforms the onerous duty into a promise of tremendous expectation. For this reason, Dante gives us violent visions, souls biting themselves, giving the finger to God, screaming at one another, spitting on one another, mocking each other. It's a harrowing vision and an attempt to try to wake us up. Despite our rational ability to know sin's evil, we're still attracted to it, and so Dante creates a visceral embodiment of it, an X-ray vision in which we're repulsed by it, made to feel its coldness, made almost to have a sense of nausea at those empty choices. But finally we come to that other unmistakable feature of the comedy, its extraordinary historical scope. Dante's special contribution is to populate his hell with a vast cast of characters taken from all historical ages. That is, representatives of almost every form of human character and inclination. As if only by examining all of these test cases throughout history can he fully externalize the full potential of the human heart. He holds the human heart up, as it were, to study it from all angles, to see all of its nooks, crannies, crevices, pits and veins, secret thoughts, hidden desires, and unclean passions. And he uses the sweeping scope of history as his way of manifesting all of that potential uncleanness. Well, it's been a long road to get to the end of the Inferno, especially after walking through those final canti of such extraordinary intensity. We are, by the end, quite overwhelmed with the vision of sin, almost sickened. You feel the weight of Dante's task, and you feel it weighing you down almost to the point of crushing you. But remember what the Psalms say. Even if I go down the Sheol, you are there. At the point which is far away from light and joy and music as possible, God is still there. Even if in a twisted parody, He's still there. Thus, even as we feel the load of sin, we at the same time cannot help but notice the power of God, a power and presence which the damned seemed blind to, even though it's all around them. But all of this is part of the plan, because for Dante, God's power can only really help those who have come to the point that they own that they need assistance. And thus Dante had to burn, blow, and break before moving on to his second canticle, Purgatory.